Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. So once the dust from the operation settled, and once the initial shock of seeing Nicolás Maduro in U.S. custody wore off, a much harder and much more uncomfortable question started to take shape, especially inside Washington and among foreign policy analysts. And that question is pretty simple on the surface, but extremely complicated underneath. Who is actually running Venezuela right now? Because here's the thing that often gets lost in the headlines. Capturing a head of state, even a long-standing authoritarian one, does not automatically translate into control over the country he ruled. History is full of examples where removing the leader was the easy part, and everything that came after turned out to be far messier, more expensive, and far less predictable than anyone expected. Right now, based on what we can verify, the United States is not directly governing Venezuela. There has been no declaration of military occupation, no U.S. civil administration installed on the ground, and no formal transfer of sovereignty. Venezuelan institutions, at least on paper, are still functioning under the framework of the existing system. The person at the center of this moment is Vice President Delcy Rodríguez, who has stepped in as acting president under Venezuela's constitutional rules. And that detail alone already tells us a lot about how cautious, or depending on how you see it, how constrained Washington is being. Because if the U.S.'s goal were immediate regime replacement in the classic sense, the most obvious move would have been to sideline the entire Maduro-era leadership and elevate an opposition figure. That did not happen. Instead, the transition, such as it is, remains firmly within the existing power structure. That choice is not accidental, and it's not ideological. It's strategic. From the American perspective, the single biggest fear right now is not that Venezuela becomes hostile overnight. The bigger fear is that Venezuela becomes ungovernable. A sudden collapse of the existing political and military hierarchy carries a very real risk of fragmentation. Different factions inside the armed forces, security services, and political apparatus could begin competing with each other. That's the kind of scenario that leads to civil conflict, not clean transitions. And Washington has learned, painfully, that civil conflicts are the hardest type of intervention to manage from the outside. This is why the current U.S. approach appears to be focused on continuity rather than rupture. Keeping the existing state machinery intact, at least temporarily, reduces the chances of an immediate breakdown. It buys time. It lowers the risk of mass violence. And it avoids forcing the U.S. into a choice between escalation and withdrawal before a clearer picture emerges. But this approach comes with its own set of risks. Delcy Rodríguez is not an outsider. She is not a technocrat parachuted in from exile. She is deeply embedded in the Maduro system. For years, she was one of its most loyal and effective operators. She understands how power actually works in Venezuela, and that cuts both ways. On the one hand, that familiarity gives her leverage over the bureaucracy and the security forces. On the other hand, it raises serious questions about where her loyalties ultimately lie. U.S. officials have suggested that there have been private communications, possibly extensive ones, between American representatives and Rodríguez. Publicly, Washington has framed its position carefully, emphasizing that it will judge the new leadership by actions rather than rhetoric. That distinction matters because so far, the rhetoric coming out of Caracas has been openly hostile. Rodríguez has publicly condemned the U.S. operation, reaffirmed Maduro's legitimacy, and leaned heavily into nationalist language. To an outside observer, that looks like defiance. But in transitional moments like this, public messaging is often aimed inward, not outward. Leaders in fragile situations frequently say one thing to reassure domestic audiences while quietly exploring very different options behind closed doors. Whether that is happening here remains unclear, and that uncertainty is exactly the problem. Another complicating factor is that Rodríguez does not operate alone. Power in Venezuela has always been distributed among a small circle, and several figures within that circle are significantly more hardline than she is perceived to be. Her brother, who currently leads the National Assembly, has a reputation for being far less flexible and far more ideologically committed to confrontation with the United States. The defense minister, who remains in place, has been openly defiant and continues to issue statements signaling resistance. So even if Rodríguez were inclined to cooperate, her ability to deliver that cooperation is not guaranteed. Control on paper does not always translate into control on the ground. This is where some analysts argue that the U.S. must have deeper leverage than what we can see publicly. The reasoning goes like this. The operation succeeded with remarkable precision, internal resistance was limited, and certain security units appeared to stand down faster than expected. Therefore, the argument continues, Washington must have cultivated significant relationships inside the Venezuelan system. It's a tempting conclusion, but it's also where analysts need to be careful. Operational success does not necessarily imply long-term political control. A network that is sufficient to enable one mission may not be capable of stabilizing an entire country afterward. Intelligence access and political loyalty are not the same thing. In past interventions, the U.S. has repeatedly overestimated how durable its internal influence really was. Contacts who were willing to assist with one operation often proved unwilling or unable to govern effectively once the spotlight turned on them. So the more accurate way to describe the current situation is not that the U.S. has control, but that the U.S. believes it has options. That belief shapes behavior, but it does not eliminate risk. This also helps explain why Washington has been reluctant to immediately empower opposition figures, including internationally recognized ones. Opposition movements may enjoy moral legitimacy abroad, but they often lack the institutional reach needed to govern a deeply polarized country without triggering backlash. Handing power to an opposition leader too quickly could split the military, provoke armed resistance, and force the U.S. into exactly the kind of prolonged involvement it is trying to avoid. In other words, the current strategy appears less about endorsing the existing leadership and more about managing the transition at the lowest possible cost. Still, this is a high-wire act. If Rodríguez consolidates power and then resists meaningful reform, Washington could find itself in a bind, having preserved a system that no longer serves its interests. If internal factions turn against each other, the risk of instability rises sharply. And if nationalist resistance gains traction, even limited cooperation could evaporate quickly. None of these outcomes are hypothetical. All of them are plausible. This is why it would be a mistake to interpret the current moment as a settled victory. What happened was a tactical success. What comes next is a strategic test. The U.S. is trying to balance several competing objectives at once, avoiding war, preventing collapse, securing economic interests, and maintaining international credibility. Those goals do not always align neatly, and compromises are already visible. So when people ask whether the U.S. controls Venezuela now, the most honest answer is no, not yet, and not in the way that word usually implies. What the U.S. has is influence, leverage, and uncertainty. How those elements interact over the next few weeks and months will determine whether this episode becomes a case study in controlled transition, or another reminder of how difficult it is to shape outcomes inside a sovereign state, even after removing the person at the top. For now, everything remains provisional. And that, more than anything else, is the real story.